My name is Liddell McWhorter. I am the James Thomas Professor in Philosophy and Professor of Environmental Studies here, and I'm delighted to introduce to you today our third speaker in this year's GESS Speaker Series, and I believe the second in the Philosophy Department Speaker Series, Dr. Baird Callicott, who is on loan to us, as you can see, from the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis, but he normally is at the University of North Texas. Dr. Callicott is a native of Memphis, Tennessee, where he took his BA at Rhodes College in philosophy and classical studies. He pursued his graduate study at Syracuse University, specializing in ancient Greek philosophy with a dissertation on Plato's theory of forms. He returned to Memphis in 1966 as an instructor at the University of Memphis, where he proceeded to get himself into trouble by participating in the civil rights movement in the city. He left Memphis and took a teaching position at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, where he offered the world's first environmental ethics course in 1971. Since that time, he's been extremely active in the developing field of environmental ethics. His contributions include both his teaching at Stevens Point and now at the University of North Texas, where he holds a distinguished research chair, but also his many publications in the field, his editorial work, and his preparation of encyclopedias, textbooks, and teaching materials. His scholarly publications are too numerous to name, but I will call your attention to 5 major works. First, in 1989, In Defense of the Land Ethic, which was my introduction to Baird Callicott's work a long time ago. Second, Earth's Insights in 1994, which has been translated into several languages. Beyond the Land Ethic in 1999, American Indian Environmental Ethics in 2004, co-authored with Michael Nelson, and most recently, Thinking Like a Planet, the Land Ethic and the Earth Ethic, 2013. And it's this most recent work that he will discuss with us this afternoon. Baird, welcome. We're really excited to have you with us today. Join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction, Del. And I want to say that Del McWhorter is one of the outstanding figures herself in environmental philosophy as well. So it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. As Del mentioned, I did my undergraduate degree at Rhodes College, and this college environment reminds me very much of my own undergraduate experience. So it feels like sort of like a homecoming for me, and I'm really pleased as well as honored to be here and to speak with you today. Okay, so what I'm going to do first here is just run through very, very quickly the background of environmental ethics. This is sort of like begins with a primer in the field for those of you who are not entirely familiar with it. So the origins of environmental ethics as an academic field of study, as Del mentioned, I taught the first college course in the subject. That was a bit of an adventure. This was right after Earth Day 1970, which was sponsored in part by a senator from Wisconsin. We all got excited about our concerns about the environment, and a group of faculty got together to create an environmental studies program, and I raised my hand and said, hey, I can teach a course in environmental ethics. And then I looked around and said, well, what the hell am I going to teach? There's no literature in the field, and so it was sort of making it up as we went along. The first papers, as you'll see, were published later, 1973 and 1975, and notice that it's an international community. So this idea was sort of in the works, and people were operating really sort of independently. Arne Næss in Norway, Richard Routley, later he changed his name to Sylvan in Australia, and Holmes Ralston in the United States. The first conference proceedings were coming out of the University of Georgia, not accidentally, because that was the home of the Institute of Ecology, and presided over by the famous Dean of Ecological Studies in the mid-century, Eugene Odom. The first monograph was by an Australian philosopher, and then the first journal in the field was published in 1979. That's Environmental Ethics. Its founder was Eugene C. Hargrove, and it's still published at the University of North Texas. And it remains the leading journal in the field. So when the journal came online, it provided a kind of community. We could get to know one another through the publications that were forthcoming in environmental ethics. And so at that point, the field sort of consolidated as a subfield in philosophy. So if we wanted to say, when does environmental ethics sort of hit the scene as a formal subdiscipline in philosophy, we'd have to say about 1979 when the first journal was printed. There's some images of the usual suspects. That little boy sitting on my lap is now 46 years old, and he has a 16-year-old son, my grandson. I couldn't get any really early pictures of the other principals there, so some older photographs will have to do. So what then brought about the emergence of this field, environmental ethics? It was a response to a consciousness raising, we might say, in the 1960s, which consisted of oil spills on beaches, rivers polluted with municipal and industrial waste. I lived in Memphis on the Mississippi River. It was an open sewer at that time. Indiscriminate use of pesticides and smog over big cities. I want you to sort of look carefully at what those phenomena were. They were all sort of local, what we today call point sources of pollution, because I'm going to revisit this later in the talk and suggest that there is a different sense of what the environmental crisis is, actually beginning in the 1980s. Then there was a crisis literature. Silent Spring, famously by Rachel Carson, and The Quiet Crisis by Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior during the John F. Kennedy administration, and he wrote a work called The Quiet Crisis, which probably lent its name to the phenomenon in the 1960s. And it makes you wonder, what was the noisy crisis? If the environmental crisis was the quiet crisis, the noisy crisis was probably, think about the era then, it was probably the Cold War and the threat of nuclear holocaust. And so the comparison here was that the environmental situation is just as threatening to us as nuclear holocaust. Well, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's nevertheless something that threatens our quality of life, livelihood, and perhaps even life itself. Then there was, and in those days, the environment on college campuses was very different than it is today. There was loud protest against the war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and as Del mentioned, I got involved in. And there was a strong demand by college students of relevancy in the college classroom. Here we were studying Plato, due in part to me, Shakespeare and literature, and on the streets, cities were burning, there was pollution, and kids were saying, we want to talk about this in our classes. And so there was spawned then a kind of shift towards relevant subjects, and environmental philosophy and ethics was one of those. And I think very significantly, there were photos of a beautiful blue planet Earth taken by Apollo 8, 10, and 11 astronauts from the moon. And my, progressive hippie friends used to say, why are we wasting all this money on this technological adventure going to the moon? We should be spending that money to relieve poverty in the inner cities. And I would say, oh, no, this is worth every penny that's spent on it, because it enables us vicariously to see the Earth as a single, beautiful, living planet in what was otherwise just what I call a desert of space. From the moon, we often talk about a lifeless surface as a moonscape. That gave you a sense of contrast as to the preciousness of the Earth, the unity of the Earth. I think of all the things that happened in this particular decade, this was the most significant one. And then that was followed by the first Earth Day in 1970s, which was an amazing phenomenon. On my campus, the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, the gymnasium was packed with students from 8 in the morning until midnight, with speaker after speaker coming and pouring out their hearts about the environmental concerns that had been bottled up for a whole decade and then were just gushing forth in this Earth Day 1970. Of course, that will never be repeated, but it was a very moving and impressive phenomenon to live through. So here are some images that suggest, what's going on, the pesticides, smog over cities. That's Che Guevara there on the red flag, images of the planet and so on. Now, when a new field comes online, we start to look back in history for our intellectual ancestors, our precursors, and so 3 figures were identified as the Holy Trinity of environmental philosophy: Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and Aldo Leopold. Thoreau was the first to suggest that nature had what he called higher uses, that it wasn't just a source of timber and water and material goods, but it could be a source of spiritual inspiration and aesthetic enjoyment and appreciation. John Muir is the first person that I've run across who actually applied the concept of rights to nature. In a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone, it's a very entertaining read, called A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, which was a journal that Muir kept, and he turned it into a book later in life, published posthumously, because it was so radical. He said things like, if a war should break out between man and the animals, I think I would side with the bears. And he was walking across the blackwater swamps of northern Florida, botanizing as he went. He was scared to death of alligators, but he had a little reflection on alligators saying, you are God's creatures no less than saints in heaven and humans on earth, and I wish you to enjoy your flowery wilds and every now enjoy a mouthful of terrified man by way of dainty. So this was pretty wild stuff. And then Aldo Leopold finally was the first person to actually compose a whole essay on environmental ethics called The Land Ethic, which was the capstone essay, the denouement of his masterpiece, the Sand County Almanac, in which this is the golden rule of the land ethic: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. Now, this is what we call a non-anthropocentric ethic. That is to say, we have direct duties to nature. It's not because nature is the vector by means of which we can affect other human beings. We should take into consideration our actions as they affect the natural environment, whether human interests are affected or involved or not. Now, Aldo Leopold is the person who I've given most attention to among these precursors, and he is often hailed as a prophet for anticipating the 1960s environmental crisis. His book was published in 1949, and he was already 2 decades ahead of the rest of us. And the Sand County Almanac is called the Bible of the environmental movement. And in recent years, I've given close attention, sort of looking at Leopold's work as a literary critic. And the reason I think that these biblical references keep coming up, prophet, that's Bible of the contemporary environmental movement, is because Leopold studied the Bible very closely when he was in the Southwest, but as literature rather than as doctrine or religion. And I think that he managed to insinuate some of the biblical style into his prose. And since we are accustomed to reading the Bible as an authoritative source, Leopold's employment of biblical rhetoric gives his words a kind of unusual authority in comparison with many other writers. And so the land ethic becomes the seminal text for academic environmental ethics, and it's the best known, and it's the environmental ethic of choice among ecologists, conservation biologists, and environmentalists. So Leopold is not just a figure that is of interest to us environmental philosophers. His work is well known in a larger community and has been influential in that community. Now, Leopold's landmark essays, there are only really 3 of them in which he directly addresses ethics. The first one is titled, innocuously, Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest. It was written in 1923, but he did not manage to get it published, and so it lay around as a manuscript in the archives of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And when Gene Hargrove, the person who founded the Journal of Environmental Ethics, was looking for stuff to publish, he was digging around in the archives and found this particular paper and published it in the first volume of Environmental Ethics, a real coup. You have a previously unpublished paper by a person of the stature of Aldo Leopold was really quite good for his journal. So then Leopold also wrote a work in 1933, 10 years later, called The Conservation Ethic, and then the Land Ethic was published in a Sand County Almanac in 1949. And the first essay, Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest, is really amazing because it's a sketch of what many years later came to be known as the Gaia hypothesis. And interestingly, it was published in Environmental Ethics the same year that James Lovelock's book, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, was published as a book, 1979. Very interesting sort of confluence of events. But now to sort of get to the point of the talk that I'm giving today is that the scale of the 1949 land ethic is a poor fit for global scale, long-term environmental concerns, and that if we turn back to the Some Fundamentals of Conservation in the Southwest with its global scale, we find the resources faintly sketched in that essay for a very different ethic, which I call the Earth ethic. So we have 2 ethics forthcoming from Aldo Leopold, the well-known land ethic, and this little-known and only faintly sketched Earth ethic, which then I try to develop in my recent work, in particular, Thinking Like a Planet. Get it? Leopold had an essay called Thinking Like a Mountain, and I'm talking about thinking like a planet. That's an issue of scale. Okay, those are some images of Aldo Leopold in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, during which he made these forays into the territory of ethics. Okay, so what I want to do first is just to sketch the philosophical foundations of the land ethic and then go on to sketch or develop a little bit the philosophical foundations of the Leopold Earth ethic. So Leopold is the sort of writer who doesn't use footnotes He's writing for a much wider audience. And so we can only discover his influences through what we call allusions. His rhetoric points in the direction that we need to look in order to see where his thinking is coming from. So I think that the foundations of the Leopold land ethic are in evolutionary biology and ecology. So we can only get clues as to these sources from Leopold's actual rhetoric. So he says, first of all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. Ecology simply enlarges the boundary of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. Thus, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens. Notice he uses our biological name here. From conqueror of the land, community, to plain member and citizen of it, it implies respect for fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So those are our clues. Now let's see if we can dig a little deeper and see what it is that Leopold is drawing on here. So first of all, the evolutionary foundations of the Leopold land ethic are borrowed from Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. Darwin devotes 2 whole chapters of the Descent of Man to the origins of ethics. And that's because ethics presents a sort of problem for Darwin, because if everything is competition, nature read in tooth and claw, devil take the hindmost, then it would seem that as evolution goes forward, we would just get meaner and meaner and nastier and more competitive and more competitive and more vicious in our relationship with one another because we're competing for limited resources, right? So that's a problem for Darwin. How can we account for something that is a phenomenon? We are ethical animals, but how's that possible given the principles of Darwinian evolution, descent with modification and natural selection? Well, Darwin has an answer for that, and I think it's summed up in this wonderful phrase of his: no tribe could hold together if murder, robbery, treachery, etc. were common. Hence, such crimes within the limits of the same tribe are branded with everlasting infamy. So what's the thinking behind this? If the tribe cannot hold together, the members would perish and therefore fail to reproduce, right? Look at us. As one writer put it, we're naked apes. We're slow, we're weak, we don't have big teeth and sharp claws. How are we gonna make it on the African savanna? Well, it's only by forming a society, a community, and pursuing life's struggle collectively, right? That's the only way we're going to survive. But if we're mean to each other, if we have nasty tendencies, we're backbiters and stabbers and treacherous, then we can't cooperate, right? So we have to have ethics in order to have a society, and we have to be living in a society in order to survive and reproduce. So that's how ethics comes to be naturally selected. So there follows from this what I call a lemma. Ethics and society or community are correlative, that is to say, as one changes, the other changes. And the corollary is that as society evolves, ethics evolve in parallel. And so here's how Darwin then envisioned the evolution of ethics. The earliest human communities were extended families called clans or gens. And I'm just listing in the right-hand column here just one typical virtue that goes with that: self-sacrifice for the good of the whole. Then extended families merge because if a small society is a good thing, then a larger society is even better when you're competing with other societies. Then tribes evolve, and along with the tribe is what is called the gift economy, where we exchange goods and services in a way that is very much nicer than the way we do today. You invite the other tribe over to your camp and you give them a bunch of gifts, and they're all happy about that, and then they go home with their gifts, and then they invite you over and they give you a bunch of gifts, and that's the way goods and services are exchanged at that level of social organization. Then tribes begin to merge into what I call ethnic nations here, and with that also the development of agriculture and property rights. Because if you're investing a lot into production that you're going to harvest later, it's important that you maintain your property, otherwise somebody can come and rip you off and you would starve, and so that becomes an important thing. Then ethnic nations evolve into nation states. Typical virtue there is patriotism. And then finally in my lifetime, and now in yours as it's working itself out, we live in a global society which we sometimes call the global village. The significant date there was 1948, when the United Nations issued its Declaration of Universal Human Rights, and that sort of marked the evolution of a global society and a corresponding global ethic, the human rights ethic. Now, Darwin, amazingly, in the 1870s, almost 100 years before, anticipated this. He says, as man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. One of the things that is very significant about Darwin is in his Beagle voyage around the world, he experienced what he thought was a lot of barbarism, and in particular slavery. And that really moved him to this kind of thinking. He was passionate about universal human rights before the idea had occurred to anyone else, really. All right, so much for the evolutionary foundations of the land ethic. Now the ecological foundations. These were borrowed from Charles Elton, who wrote a work in 1927 called Animal Ecology. By the way, he was only 25 years old when he wrote this, and he knocked it out in about just under 3 months. It's a landmark essay. It should be inspiring to all of you 20-somethings out there, that if he could do it, you can too. He develops what we call the community paradigm in ecology, and that is basically that the biota is organized like human societies are organized. Each plant or animal occupies what Elton called a niche, but he sometimes calls it a role or even a profession in the economy of nature. So we have three great guilds: the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers, and these general functions are divided into myriads of specialties. And as Elton says in his book, which is very well written, one of the funny things he says is plant ecology developed before animal ecology, and that's because plants do not rush away when the inquiring ecologist comes to study them. Another remark he makes is, when the ecologist sees a badger, something like the thought, "there goes the vicar," should occur in his mind. You should think about its role or profession or its niche in the economy of nature. So here's then the simple thing. We remember the previous slide about how tribes form from clans and nation states and the global village. Well, we just add one more step to that process. The extended family, the ethnic nation, the nation state, the global village, and ecology informs us that we're also members of a biotic community. It's a beautifully elegant development of an ethic, and so then Leopold writes once again, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So this is, you know, it's just like, it's beautiful, what I call intellectual architecture here, putting together Darwin's basic notion of the origin of ethics, adding the community concept from ecology, and voila, there is the land ethic that just spills right out from that. But there are problems with the Leopold land ethic. It was articulated in 1949, or published in 1949. And since then, there has been, as we say, some ecological water under the bridge from that point forward. Leopold was basing his notions of ecology on a 1927 book, and here we are in 2014. So what has happened in ecology since Leopold's day and ours? Well, for one thing, biotic communities are now regarded by ecologists as sort of fuzzy entities. Their spatial boundaries are vague, they're porous, things are coming in and going out. If you look closely, samples of the same type of community are not very similar. The communities are also dynamic at multiple temporal scales. The temporal boundaries between successional stages are vague. Successional change is not directional, doesn't terminate in a stable, self-replicating climax stage. Natural disturbance is common by fire, flood, drought, wind. All of that is frequent and rhythmic. So there's little integrity or stability associated with biotic communities to be preserved. So some of the rug is being, the ecological rug is being pulled out from under the land ethic here. Now I think, and I've done some work in this area, to what I call dynamize the land ethic. In other words, rather than say, oh, the new ecology is messed up and we don't have to pay attention to it, that's not the way I usually respond to things. Okay, so this is the state of the science. It does have an impact on the foundations of the land ethic, so let's see if we can work with the science and, you know, make the land ethic sort of modernized and dynamized. So I would just like to say that biotic communities in contemporary ecology are really no more fuzzy than paradigmatic human communities, such as Denton, Texas, where I live. Denton started out as a farming community. You know, it had a hardware store and a feed store and stuff like that. It was also the county seat. Then it became a college town. University of North Texas is there, 36,000 students. There's also another college there, Texas Women's University. So you get a lot of college professors and college students moving in on top of the farmers. And now it's a bedroom community for Dallas, among other things. And so, but hey, we all still say, hey, Denton is the new Austin and let's keep it weird. So it's, we still have a lot of community loyalty despite all of the changes that are going on. People come and go, move in and out. So we can add successional change, disturbance regimes, and so on to evolutionary change and replace the norms of integrity and stability with norms of natural ecological dynamics. So what I have done is to suggest we could revise the golden rule of the Leopold land ethic. Now that's just about as hubristic as somebody deciding they're going to revise the Bible, because the Sand County Almanac is the Bible of the conservation movement, but I dared to do it and offer a thing is right when it tends to disturb the biotic community. only at normal temporal and spatial scales. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So we have basically replacing temporal and spatial scales of processes instead of integrity and stability. Well, anyway. Now, I think that the dynamized Leopold land ethic is still useful, but it's limited. It's useful in ethically evaluating community up to landscape scaled and rapid and reversible human disturbances such as point source pollution, agricultural and forestry practices, recreational activities, local development, residential, commercial, industrial. But I think it's limited in regard to larger global scale, long-term, possibly irreversible human disturbances such as climate change, mass extinction or biodiversity loss, and the stratospheric ozone hole. And remember, we talked about early in my talk the environmental crisis of the 1960s, and I asked you to pay close attention to what that was all about. Smog over cities, polluted rivers, pesticides being sprayed on fields, and that sort of thing. All of those are local and regional phenomena. But in the 1980s, the signature of the environmental crisis became global in scope. And so I call this the second wave of the environmental crisis. It rolled over us. If we wanted to precisely date it, in 1988. That was the year in which there were massive fires in Yellowstone National Park. It was an unusually hot summer, and so all the talk radio was about global warming. Suddenly that had come out of the scientific discussion and into a public discussion. And in the mid-1980s, the Society for Conservation Biology was established because it was perceived that we were having a sixth mass extinction event, only the sixth in the 3.5 billion year biography of the Earth. That's something different from an occasional extinction of the dodo or the passenger pigeon or something like that. This is biodiversity more collectively conceived is being reduced at an unprecedented rate such that we can speak of a sixth great mass extinction event. And then finally, none of the scientists could believe it, but all their data was telling them that the ozone envelope or membrane over the planet was beginning to thin, and a hole was actually appearing over the Antarctic during the austral summer. And so suddenly the environmental crisis is now scaled up to planetary proportions. It's not just about oil spills and smog and pesticides and so on. It's global, spatially, and also temporally. Suppose there is a mass extinction event, how long into the future will it take before biodiversity recovers? Well, it will recover, in 10, 12 million years, something like that. Not meaningful in terms of our human scales of experience. Climate change, yeah, that's reversible too, but on a scale not so much of millions of years, but of multiples of thousands of years, and that's if we do something about it. The ozone hole proved to be tractable. All we had to do is stop using chlorofluorocarbons. The Montreal Convention put a stop to that, and hey, it's starting to recover. So there we have an example of how to fix things. Just stop using them, like gasoline and coal and stuff. That's not going to happen, right? As we did with the refrigerant propellants. Okay, so the 1923 Leopold Earth ethic then is a better fit for contemporary global long-term environmental concerns. Now I'm going to here quote from this 1923 essay, which is just remarkable. So be patient with me here. I'm going to read 2 slides, and just follow along with your eyes, but at the same pace that I'm going, okay? So you're getting it in 2 modalities here. Leopold writes, "It is at least not impossible to regard the Earth's parts, soil, mountains, rivers, atmosphere, etc., as organs or parts of organs of a coordinated whole, each part with a definite function. And if we could see this whole as a whole through a great period of time, we might perceive not only organs with coordinated functions, but possibly also that process of consumption and replacement, which in biology we call the metabolism or growth. In such a case, we would have all the visible attributes of a living thing, which we do not now recognize to be such because it is too big and its process is too slow. And there would also follow that invisible attribute, a soul or consciousness, which many philosophers of all ages ascribe to all living things and aggregates thereof, including the quote-unquote dead earth." One more. "There's not much discrepancy except in language between this conception of a living earth and the conception of a dead earth, with enormously slow, intricate, and interrelated functions among its parts, as given us by physics, chemistry, and geology. The essential thing for present purposes is that both admit the interdependent functions of the elements. Possibly in our intuitive perceptions, which may be truer than our science and less impeded by words than our philosophies, we realize the indivisibility of the earth, its soil, mountains, rivers, forests, climate, plants, animals, and respect it collectively, not only as a useful servant, but as a living being, vastly less alive than ourselves in degree, but vastly greater than ourselves in time and space. A being that was old when the morning stars sang together and when the last of us has been gathered unto his fathers will still be young." Do you recognize any phrases in that last sentence that are familiar to you? Right out of the Bible. When the morning stars sang together is from Job. When the last of us has been gathered unto our fathers is from 2 Kings 2. So here's the way Leopold works in this biblical rhetoric into his own prose and transforms it for his own use, and gives his writing an unusual power and authority. Okay, so this was 1979, and I was reading this like in February. There was still snow on the ground in Wisconsin, and I was just so blown away that I just ran out of the house into the backyard, and at that particular moment, the aurora borealis was unusually active that night. The northern lights were flashing green across the celestial equator, almost to the ecliptic, and I thought, I am seeing the soul or consciousness of the earth, because what else is our consciousness except the electromagnetic activity of our brains? Now, don't ask me what I was smoking on that particular evening to enjoy this experience, but that was quite a memorable event. Okay, so as to the ethical foundations of the Leopold Earth ethic, Leopold identifies from a philosophical point of view three sort of paradigms of ethics. The first is a collective kind of virtue ethics. And he says Ezekiel seems to scorn, he had quoted Ezekiel before this, to scorn waste, pollution, and unnecessary damage is something unworthy, something damaging not only to the reputation of the waster, but to the self-respect of the craft and the society of which he is a member. And this is just mentioned in passing. Then there is long anthropocentrism, responsibility to future generations. Leopold says, the privilege of possessing the earth entails the responsibility of passing it on, the better for our use, not only to immediate posterity, but to the unknown future. And this is mentioned in passing. And then finally, there is what we would call a Kantian non-anthropocentrism, and that is respect for the earth's intrinsic value. It is possible that Ezekiel respected the soil not only as a craftsman respects his material, but as a moral being respects a living thing. And this is developed over the next 6 paragraphs, 2 of which I read to you previously. Okay, so the scientific foundations of the Leopold Earth ethic are biogeochemistry, not ecology. There's an interesting coincidence that Vladimir Vernadsky, who is sort of like Einstein to Russian science, was developing the biosphere concept just at the same time that Leopold was toying with this. And so Leopold is really anticipating the Gaia hypothesis, and here are the leading Gaia figures: Vernadsky, G.E. Hutchinson, James Lovelock, and Lynn Margulis. So the Leopold Earth ethic avoids the temporal and spatial scale problems bedeviling the land ethic. Biotic communities and ecosystems are difficult to isolate as robust entities, and some suspect that they are mere theoretical artifacts. What is an ecosystem? Well, it depends on how you bound it. Let's just to take an example. If a limnologist is studying predator-prey relationships in a lake, the boundary of the lake ecosystem is the shoreline. If an ecologist is studying eutrophication in the lake, then the boundary of the ecosystem is the watershed. So with this sort of shifting boundaries, we wonder if ecosystems are not partly created by the imaginations of ecologists. But the earth, by contrast, whereas ecosystems and biotic communities are, what in philosophy we would say they have a sort of problematic ontology, that the earth, by contrast, is undoubtedly a real entity. It has clear boundaries. There it is. There's no doubt it's a real being. It has definite boundaries. Has it got a soul or consciousness? Well, I don't know. The old balance of nature paradigm in ecology considered ecosystems to be closed except for energy and water inputs, to be self-regulating, which follows from closed. They tend toward a single stable point of equilibrium. They have determinate and invariant successional pathways. They have disturbances are exceptional events, and humans are excluded as ecological factors. That's the old ecology that Leopold is operating under. The new flux of nature paradigm in ecology considers ecosystems to be open to nutrients, pollution, motile organisms, have external as well as internal regulatory factors, multiple basins of ecological attraction, directionless and endless successional change, disturbance regimes. Human influences are incorporated and have been for thousands of years. There's no place that's really pristine, unaffected by human activities. They have fuzzy spatial and temporal boundaries, and boundaries are determined by the scientific questions posed. So the biosphere has many characteristics of the old ecosystem paradigm. It's closed, only open to sunlight, other radiation, and incidental cosmic material. It's self-regulating, that's the core of the Gaia hypothesis. It has single points of equilibria for many biogeochemical cycles. For example, the atmospheric oxygen is at 21%, remains stable, nitrogen at 78. Atmospheric carbon dioxide used to be at 280 points per million per volume, but it's now exceeding 400. And the global average temperature used to be 15 degrees centigrade and is now increasing. So until recently, the biosphere was free of significant human influence. Thus, the Earth, as a well-defined, self-regulating entity, is a robust object that we can respect as such, and its stable points of equilibria can serve as norms in relation to which we can morally evaluate those of our actions affecting these equilibria. So that is basically a non-anthropocentric Earth ethic. It's an ontologically robust object of respect. It has clear norms, and we can therefore measure the moral value of our actions against these norms. Now, I also want to consider an anthropocentric, that is to say, a human-centered aspect of the Earth ethic, because I think that this is also important. For the present and immediate future, we need to consider issues of climate justice as a part of our global citizenship. Remember, we are now members of a global community, the global village. We're global citizens, and that means we need to consider climate justice. So the adverse effect of global climate change will not be evenly or fairly distributed. Sea level, warming, desertification, catastrophic weather events, ecological dislocation will hit some of us harder than others, and those hardest hit are often both most vulnerable and least responsible for global climate change. So this raises clear issues of international justice. Those responsible owe some form of compensation to those affected. This is very controversial politically, of course. Future generations also will be more severely affected than the present, so we need to consider issues of intergenerational justice as well as international justice. Now, I think it's very interesting that Leopold expressed concern not only for immediate posterity, but for the unknown future. And I'm wondering, how far into the unknown future can we be concerned for others? Now, I'm concerned personally, talking about now immediate posterity, for my grandson's future and for his grandson's future, because if he has a grandson, he's going to be concerned about his grandson's future, and I'm concerned about him. So therefore, that concern sort of transfers forward, but beyond that, personal engagement sort of wanes. Now, some people have reflected the Iroquois who suggest that we extend our concern out for 7 generations, but I did the arithmetic on that, and that only really results in about 250 years out, whereas the effects of global climate change are projected to run out for several thousand years. And so that doesn't really get us very far into the future. So the ecologically scaled anthropogenic insults, oil spills, deforestation, these come and go in decades. As I say, the serious effects of climate change extend out much further than that. So what can we be concerned about here? Now, one of the paradoxes that philosopher Derek Parfit has developed is called the non-identity problem. I call it the Parfit paradox, and let me explain what that is. Suppose we do nothing about climate change, and future generations will live in a world that's more energetic, with more destructive weather, and hotter temperatures, and desertification, and floods, and all of that. Can they look back and say, you bastards who lived in the 20th and 21st century should have done something so that my world is not messed up the way that it is? Parfit says no. Because if we had made drastic changes in policy and law, it would have affected our behavior, and we would travel less. We wouldn't stay up so late watching television because we'd be spending too much energy and we're living huddled up and cold, and so we would go to bed earlier and not have anything else to do. And different sperm would meet different eggs, and different people would be born. So those people, if we did nothing, looking back and saying and blaming us for ruining their world, they can't do that, because if we did something about it, they wouldn't exist. Other people would exist in their stead. So this is a real paradox. What it seems to me that it does is undermine the idea that we have duties to individuals in the future. We can only have a sort of collective object of concern. So I think that we need to do two things. We need to scale up the moral agent. People often ask me at the end of a lecture like this, what can I do to mitigate climate change? And my answer is light bulbs, Priuses, what you really need to do is vote. You need to vote for the people who will institute policies that will make a difference, because your individual attempt to reduce your carbon footprint is negligible in terms of the total that's produced. So we need, this is what's called collective action. We need to act collectively, and the responsibility, therefore, is not on each of us. Now, that doesn't mean that you're changing your lifestyle won't be important, but in an indirect way. What it will do, hopefully it's contagious. It'll build up a certain constituency that will make the political changes that are necessary, really, to accomplish anything in regard to climate change. And so it's changes in policy and law that are the most important that we can do. So whom or what does global climate change threaten in the unknown future? Like I said, individuals is very problematic because of the Parfit paradox. So the human species, are we at risk of making ourselves extinct? I don't think so. Humans are very resourceful animals and will survive in smaller groups. I think that what's really at stake here is global human civilization. And I think that we can see the business as usual future in the present day failed states such as Somalia, Mali, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, a state of small bands led by warlords and a descent into barbarism. So what I think is really at stake is global human civilization. That's at risk of collapsing in the face of unprecedented extremes of a more energetic planet. So the scale of global civilization, Leopold indicates that as we know it, it's been around for about 3,000 years. We can project it 3,000 years into the future. That's about the same scale as climate change is taking place. So it fits scale-wise in terms of temporal scale. And it's something that's concrete. It's something that we can relate to presently. What do I mean by global human civilization? The art, the architecture, the science, the music, the global economy. This is something that we enjoy today, and we should consider ourselves fiduciaries of it, and that's what we pass on to future generations. It's concrete in the sense that we can, it's here and now. It's not some vague thing off in the future, and it's something that we can care about here and now, and so I'm suggesting that that is a fitting object for our ethical concern. And so I'll just end right there, and I try to develop all of this in my book, Thinking Like a Planet. So thank you for your patience and attention. Thanks.